Welcome to the video on castling. Like en passant, there is another move in chess which is a little unusual. However, unlike en passant, you will likely be using this move almost every game. It is a good idea to do so. This move is called castling. Castling is unique for two reasons. Number one, because it is the only move in chess that involves moving two pieces simultaneously together on the same move, or the same turn. And it is also the only move in chess where the king is allowed to move two squares instead of just one. So let's look and learn about how to castle properly. Take a look at this position. A few moves have been played in the opening. Looking at white's position and the king here on e1, of the legal squares this king can move, the first thought might be that these two are the only squares it can move to, and normally you would be absolutely correct. However, castling involves moving the king two squares, in this case to g1. So check this out. So what just happened? What happened was the king moved two squares, 1, 2, to the right, and then the rook that was once on h1 also moved two squares directly next to the king. So both pieces almost changed places in a way. Okay? So just to show this again, because obviously you might be going like, what? That's a little confusing. So once again, from this position, you are allowed to do this move. And again, this is completed in one turn. Okay, so how does this work and why should you do it? Why are you going to be doing it frequently? We're going to cover more in depth the concept of king safety later on in the curriculum. But you'll notice that castling gets the king out of the middle of the board where a lot of the action is. Okay, so bringing the king to the side of the board is better for its safety. Alright, so there are some more examples with fewer pieces on the board to really distill what castling looks like again, just to repeat it. Okay, so let's take a look at a situation like this, for example. Just focusing on the kings and the rooks for a second. Okay, so there are some rules that you have to memorize, okay, where you will know whether or not you can castle, okay? And it's important to note that you can't castle all the time. Castling is a privilege, and sometimes, by way of how the game is played, you or your opponent may lose the privilege of castling. So first of all, take a look at this position. Focus on white's pieces for a second. If you wanted to castle now, you could. The reason why is because there are no pieces in between the king and the rook. And keep in mind that you can castle on either side of the board, and the principle is the exact same. The king is going to move two squares in one of the directions, and then the rook, on whatever side of the board you're castling, just moves directly behind it, as if it jumps over the king. Okay? So if you wanted to castle queenside, don't get confused. The white king is not going to end up here. The easiest way to remember it is you're just going to count two squares in that direction. So 1, 2, and then the rook goes directly next to it, jumps over it. All right? So that's castling queenside. And again, you can castle kingside as well. All right? So the king moves 1, 2, and the rook hops over it. Okay, so there are some ways that you can lose the privilege of castling. To begin with, the easiest way to remember that you can't castle, as I mentioned, is if there are any pieces in between the king and the rook when you're trying to castle, you can't castle because you're not allowed to go through your own pieces. All right. Number two, if you move either the rook or the king at any point before castling, you cannot castle anymore. All right? So focusing on the rook for a second. If I move my rook here to g1, for example, I can no longer castle for the remainder of the game on the king side, okay? My only option now if I want to castle at some point is to go queen side. So that remains permanent. Same thing if I move this rook, let's say to b1, all right? Even though I'm not blocking the king from moving to c1, because I've already moved that queenside rook, I can no longer castle on that side of the board. I have to castle kingside now if I want to castle at all. Going hand in hand with that, if my king ever moves at any point in the game, it doesn't matter to which square, any of these legal squares, okay? If the king moves at all, you lose castling privileges to either side of the board. Okay, there is no more castling allowed if your king has to move. So this is something that you want to pay attention to in your games as you're starting out. If you know castling is a good thing because it makes your king safer by moving it from the center of the board, you want to be careful about moving your king because you want to save those privileges for castling. Okay, so what are the other ways that you can lose your castling privileges and what prevents you from castling? Well, they all kind of have to do with check, a concept that you've learned about recently. All right, you or your opponent cannot castle if you are in check, you cannot castle into check, and you cannot castle through check. So let me give you guys plenty of examples of what this looks like to make sure there is zero confusion. All right, so let's go back to this previous game that I was demoing as an example. All right, so in this position, you'll notice that, both the knight and the bishop have been moved out of the way from their original squares. Neither the king on e1 or the rook on h1 have moved yet in the game, so castling is perfectly legal. However, let's take a look at a possible game scenario if a few more moves were played. All right, so let's pretend that this happens, and in this possession, black plays bishop to b4 check, okay? Because white's king is put into check, I cannot castle out of it, okay? This is an illegal move, all right? Now, remember, you learned about how to defend and get out of check in a previous video, all right? So if you need a refresher, you can go back and look at it. But instead of moving the king, all right, you should probably exercise your other options. In this case, it will be blocking the check, right? Because nothing can really capture the piece and take the bishop on b4 that's giving the check. So, for example, white could play knight to c3, blocking the check, and hopefully still maintain the castling privileges in the next move or so. Okay, so that's an example of, you not being allowed to castle out of check. Same thing holds for castling into check. What does this look like? Let's play a couple more moves as an example. Let's pretend black goes knight to g4. A couple more moves are made. White takes the pawn on f5. And now black, let's say, wants to castle. Okay? This is an illegal move because you may notice the bishop on c4 is protecting the square on g8. So you cannot castle because that puts you into check, which is an illegal move. All right? So the third and final example with regards to check of when you cannot castle has to do with castling through check. All right, so let's see how this can take place in an actual game after a few moves. All right, so in this position, once again, white's knight and bishop have been moved out of the way. White's king and rook have not moved either, so all the criteria for castling has been met, and normally you would be able to. However, take a look at this bishop here on a6. Its diagonal and its line of control cuts across this whole line, right? So because the bishop protects the f1 square, I as white cannot castle because that castles through the line of check. All right, so this again is an illegal move. Okay? those are the three ways that check prevents you or your opponent from castling. Take a look at this example as a nice little wrap-up. Pretend you're white here. Pretty simple position. Ask yourself how white can castle in this situation. The answer is white cannot castle at all. Alright, so let's go through the criteria. Have white's king or rooks moved? No, I don't think so. They're on the original starting squares and they seem good, taking it at face value. However, white cannot castle queenside because he would be castling through check. How is that possible? Take a look at this. This knight on c3, which protects the d1 square, it qualifies just as if a bishop was controlling the d1 square, or a rook, or a queen, or any piece for that matter. You just cannot castle through check. And likewise, white also cannot castle kingside because the black bishop on f1 is simply in the way. You cannot castle through a potential capture, just like you can't castle through your own pieces. Okay? Again, white would be forced, for instance, to take this bishop, but because the rook or king would have to move, castling would no longer be possible for white in this scenario. Okay, so that is the basics on castling. It seems a little complicated at first, but I will reassure you it is not, mainly for two reasons. Number one is because it is a useful move that you will be playing, or should be playing, a lot, almost every game in fact. So you will get tons of practice. And number two, it's a very unique move, right? It is the only move that involves moving two pieces simultaneously, and the formula is very simple. So going back to this original example here, it just involves moving the king 2 squares over, all right, whether kingside or queenside, and then the rook just literally hops over and goes right next to it. That's it. Again, with practice, this will become second nature. Just make sure to memorize the rules for when you and your opponent cannot castle. Feel free to practice the examples provided associated with this castling video. Thank you for watching.